As housing prices continue to soar in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, many people have been left wondering whether they will ever be able to afford to buy a home. Paul Kershaw is a professor at the University of British Columbia School of Population and Public Health and the founder of the awareness campaign Generation Squeeze. He's concerned that if policies don't change, cities could risk becoming, quote, generational ghost towns. And Paul Kershaw joins us now for more. Welcome to Upper Canada.
Thanks so much for having me.
Nice to have you here. I'm just going to, let's have Sheldon bring up here this survey from Bank of Montreal, which will set the table for the discussion to come. Millennials across the country expect to spend an average of $350,000 on their first home. That's the expectation. In Ontario, they expect to spend an average of $415,000, so a recognition that it's going to cost more. 42% said it's hard to find an affordable home in a location that meets their needs. 60% are having difficulty saving for a house that meets their needs. 29% don't think they will be able to afford a home, and when asked what they wanted to purchase, how middle class is this? 51% said a detached home. No lofts, no bachelor apartments or whatever. Let's start with this. Do millennials, in terms of housing, really have it as bad as they say they do?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the data may even suggest it's worse than what those polling results imply. I mean, here are the facts. Today, the typical 25 to 34-year-old earns thousands of dollars less for full-time work, even though they're more than twice as likely to have post-secondary, which means more of us start with larger debts.
Sorry, they earn thousands less than what?
Yes, they earn thousands less than in 1976, once you adjust for inflation. And I choose that year because that's the time at which today's aging population were young adults. So it's kind of comparing what was it like to be a young adult back in the day for today's aging population compared to now.
And it's harder now.
It is harder now. A younger demographic, as I said, is earning thousands less for full-time work, even though they're more than twice as likely to have post-secondary. So more of us are starting with post-secondary debt. And then we face housing prices, which from coast to coast have increased hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Now, we hear about that in Toronto, Vancouver, to a lesser extent Montreal. You just said coast to coast.
Coast to coast.
That means everywhere?
Yeah, in 1976, the average cost of a home in today's dollars was slightly over $200,000. Now across the country, it's more than $400,000. And so in 1976, it took the typical young adult about 5 years of full-time work to save a 20% down payment on an average home. But if you flash forward to today, from coast to coast, the average now takes 12 years of work.
To pay for that down payment.
And then you move on and you think about what is it like in Metro Toronto? Well, a year and a half ago, it had already reached 15 years of full-time work. And given the changes we've seen recently, it's probably closer to 20. And in Metro Vancouver, where I come from, it is now 23 years of full-time work to save a 20% down payment on an average home if you were audacious enough to think you'd get into one.
And let's recall, the kind of full-time work you probably could get in 1976 doesn't compare to today, where the work is a lot more precarious. For millennials.
But here we're controlling for that. We're actually saying, are you one of the privileged people who actually landed full-time work, let alone accounting for the greater degree of precarity that a younger demographic is facing?
You know what the average house price in the capital city of the province of Ontario is today?
I think 760-odd thousand.
That's everything.
That's housing. Yeah.
That's housing. You want a detached house?
You're
$1 million
$1 million
bucks.
plus.
$1 million bucks. It's unbelievable. So, having said that, I presume millennials will just simply have to readjust their expectations of what's possible, yes?
The reality is that for a younger demographic going forward, we're going to be a country where renting for long periods of our lives, if not indefinitely, is increasingly the norm. Now, that in and of itself isn't terrible. There are many other countries where renting is much more commonplace. And if that's the way in which it'll go for Canada, I think we have a responsibility as a younger demographic to be willing to adapt. But let's recognize the degree of adaptation it is expecting of that younger demographic. There's a range of things that go hand in hand with renting. First, there's less security. And a younger demographics in our prime childbearing and rearing years. And you want to know, my kid just started in that childcare space. I want her to be there for a couple of years, or I want her to be in this school for several years. And oftentimes the way to get that security of location was through home ownership. And renting doesn't afford that nearly as much. Simultaneously, home ownership has been primary way by which we've tended to plan for our later retirements. It has been an important source of wealth accumulation.
It's a pension for a lot of people.
And that's why it's so important not simply to talk about housing with respect to millennials, but to also talk about housing with respect to an older population. Because high home prices today aren't uniformly bad or uniformly good. It all depends on when you got into the market. And somebody like my mom, who I adore, She thinks high home prices are golden. It's precisely why the typical Canadian over 55 reports hundreds of thousands of dollars of additional wealth as they head into retirement. And this is not the 1%, this is like the typical older Canadian. And so we need to recognize that what actually is harming a younger demographic has been precisely the same set of forces that has been improving retirement security and wealth accumulation for our parents and grandparents. And we need to find a way to start having an intergenerational conversation that says, how can we protect our aging parents and grandparents, but not let all of the harm fall to their kids and grandchildren?
I hear you, but before we have that conversation, and we will continue that conversation in a second, there may be some people watching this right now saying, you know, boo-hoo, there are real homeless people out there who've got it way bad than, you know, way worse than millennials, and we're focusing on their travails. Is that appropriate to do? What would you say to that?
What a great question. I would say in Canada, the answer is, yeah, strategically we should. The data show that Canadians are not very good at addressing poverty. We are called out in international rankings as having higher poverty rates than many other industrialized countries. We actually only have one success story with respect to reducing poverty, and it has to do with seniors. And we solved the problem, or at least dramatically reduced the problem, but we didn't do it by having an anti-poverty strategy for seniors. What we did is we said, let's build a retirement income security system called old age security for everybody at that life course stage.
We gave people money.
And let's build a healthcare system from which everyone will benefit, especially at that life course stage. And what it did is it created political will and public enthusiasm for it in numbers that were great enough to actually build the benefits at a level that made a difference to that middle class wallet. And in the process of doing it, it floated the boats of those who were more marginalized economically. And it created enough political will to say, hey, we can build a guaranteed income supplement into this old age security system. And that will especially target the needs of those most economically vulnerable. But if you take the other stories in Canada about trying to address homelessness or poverty, we've been really weak because we've tended to say, let's have an anti-poverty strategy for children. But we don't have the right instincts in Canada to say, yeah, we ought to invest in those poor families with kids, because more often than not, we're concerned if the benefits are too great, people will opt for those benefits instead of taking a job. And because of that cultural predilection, we haven't been successful if we only try and address homelessness or poverty for those most marginalized. But if we replicate what we've done for seniors, we can say, now is a moment when housing is impacting entire generations of young people. Let's use that to help light a fire under our rear ends to say we can transform policy that will work for us and our grandparents, and in the process build the political will to refine the policy details so that we float the boats of those who are especially marginalized.
All right, in which case, let's see if this constitutes a fire that you would find acceptable. I want to quote something here from the CEO of Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is a federal crown corporation. This is Evan Siddall, writing in the Globe and Mail after the government introduced the so-called stress test for mortgages. Here's what he wrote. Action was needed. The level of household indebtedness in Canada is now at a historic high of 168% of disposable income. The Bank of Canada calls this factor the greatest vulnerability to our economy. The bank has highlighted growing debt levels among the most vulnerable homeowners as a particular cause for concern. Would you like to see the federal government take a stronger hand in dealing with this issue?
Yes. I think all levels of government need to rethink our approach to housing policy, and it needs to be a multi-pronged rethink. On one hand, we need to use policy, including tax policy, to moderate the demand for housing. We have to really commit, first and foremost, to what I would call a principle of homes first, investment second. And by that I mean, let's remember that the primary purpose of our real estate market should be the efficient supply of suitable homes that are in reach for what typical people can earn. Maybe more of us will be renters, some will still be aspiring homeowners, but we've got to keep those home prices in reach for what you can earn. If people can then make a return on their housing investment, that's fabulous, but that now needs to be increasingly a secondary consideration to keeping those home prices in reach. And
that
using
doesn't sound like capitalism, if I may say.
Oh, it absolutely is absolutely capitalism.
Let's worry about the needs of the... Go ahead.
No, I mean, because capitalism recognizes that not all commodities are just, widgets. Some commodities are much closer to needs. And so homes are not the same sorts of things as my iPhone.
So you're looking at homes as a basic civil right in the same way that healthcare is, the same way education is?
I think we all have personal responsibility to adapt to the changing realities of our marketplace. So a younger demographic's going to have to rethink our savings strategy, our spending strategies, and we're going to have to be willing to live smaller, further from where we work or study, and without access to yards for our kids. That's going to be increasingly the norm, especially in our big, beautiful cities like Toronto and Vancouver, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about how we can use our policy, both on taxation side, on supply side, and some other factors, to think about, wow, this is causing a great deal of harm, and housings are not just investments. They are also homes, and those homes become fundamental for a range of other goods and are critical for our health and well-being.
Okay, in which case, let's talk about, what's this you call it? Age-specific housing credits? Is that an idea you like? What is that?
Well, we already have them. I think age remains fundamental to our approach to thinking about housing policy, but right now the approach is outdated. So for instance, with regards to property taxation, many provinces will have some homeowners grants, rebates. And those rebates tend to be specifically larger for someone who's over 65. Interestingly, what that's meaning is they're saying for the very group of people who are most likely to have won out in the lottery of housing timing, that's the group of people who we're going to most privilege with the preferred tax rates on property.
Well, you know why?
No, I'm actually curious. Why? Tell me.
They vote.
They vote.
Kids don't vote.
It also reflects some pressures back in the day. Back in, a couple of decades ago, seniors were more likely to be economically vulnerable. They did have some of the highest rates of low income status of any age group in the country. But now, for some of the reasons I talked about earlier, our healthcare, our old age security system, seniors report the lowest rates of low income of any age group in the country. So now is the time to recognize that's not necessarily the demographic any longer that needs the biggest tax subsidies with respect to taxing property.
It is, however, the demographic you want to cater to if you want to win re-election. I'm just telling it like it is.
Yeah, but that's why Generation Squeeze exists, though. So I'm a professor at UBC, and we have this great evidence about what are the things that make us healthy and well. But if we just talk about in the academy about these things, then we don't have much influence on policy. So Gen Squeeze is marrying the information with mobilizing a younger demographic. We're committed to revitalizing democratic engagement because we know democracy really only works for those who organize and show up. And we've got a great example, say, from the Canadian Association of Retired Persons. They've been lobbying on behalf of those over 50 for decades, and to good effect, protecting my mom and my grandmother. But there had been no corresponding group doing that for younger Canadians until Gen Squeeze. And so we're trying to fill that niche. We have a lot of catch up to do. But that is the purpose of Generation Squeeze, to be that fire under our rear ends, to say we have a proud tradition in Canada of building and adapting social policy to solve big problems facing entire generations that individuals alone cannot work their way out of. But that's only happened when people got organized and show up. So we need to do that.
I was going to say, you're from Vancouver.
Yes.
Not originally, but that's where you hang out now. And you've called Vancouver the canary in the national coal mine on this issue. What does that refer to?
Well, in many respects, I like to say that Vancouver and BC are to housing what Saskatchewan once was to medical care. So this isn't the first time we've faced an unaffordability challenge in Canada. We've done it in the past, not least of which with respect to being able to afford to go to the doctor or the hospital. And it was an especially acute problem back in the day in Saskatchewan, where you then had people, given the severity of the problem, they start dreaming differently about, hey, how might we make this important need accessible to our residents? And the dreams in that region then eventually alerted all of us from coast to coast how we shared a common problem with regards to affording healthcare. And then we thought that was such a big problem that we could dream differently enough to solve it. And now we're so proud of the policy adaptations that helped to solve that we define ourselves as different from our neighbors to the south in the light of that grand policy adaptation we call medical care. I would say Vancouver is to housing now what Saskatchewan was to medical care. We have in Vancouver housing prices even worse than in Toronto. Did you know that in Metro Vancouver, that's the region where half of BC lives, it's all the burbs around the downtown Vancouver core, only 15% of homes cost less than $500,000 and provide access to more than 2 bedrooms.
Okay, can I ask a question in return?
Yes.
So what?
Well, a generation ago, $500,000 would have bought you 2 entire houses. It's a big problem now if it only barely buys you 2 bedrooms. Because we may tout in British Columbia right now that we have good growth rates and we have reasonably low unemployment by comparison with lots of other provinces. But if what's driving that is a real estate market that ultimately compromises the standard of living for generations of younger people, that is not a kind of growth that's actually sustainable or going to make us prosperous over time.
Well, you say compromises the standard of living, and here. I'm going to give you the devil's advocate
By
here
all,
argument
please
on
do.
behalf
You
of,
won't be the first.
on behalf of our conservative viewers here who would say, look, this is the market. This is the way the market works. There's no law in this country that entitles millennials or anybody else for that matter to live in houses that they can't afford, to live on the most expensive. I mean, where does it say that if you can't afford to live in the most expensive city in the country, you're somehow entitled to do so?
Doesn't say that anywhere.
Right. So, but you're presenting an argument here saying it's better for us all if we figure out how to make that happen.
Well,
if
you're a region which can't actually home the people who are talented and educated and trained to actually fulfill the jobs in that region, that is not a strategy for sustainability. And also, I mean, what does it mean to be the kind of country like Canada is, where we're aspiring for using our prosperity in valuable ways, but then we allow the standard of living to decline for our younger demographics? Let me repeat. From coast to coast, it now takes an extra 7 years to save a 20% down payment on an average home. And that average home is more often now that condo with a balcony than a house with a yard. That's a pretty big deterioration in the standard of living for a group of people who've lived only 25 to 34 years. Like, that's a chunk of their life. If we're wanting to push prosperity, we got to think like, what does prosperity look like? It's not simply growth, because if the growth results in younger demographics earning less, and then facing way higher housing prices, it's those two things which determine the standard of living. Or
what it means is young people can't afford to live in downtown Toronto and they'll have to move to Hamilton.
But I'm giving you stats about Metro Vancouver. So that's, for your listeners, these are the burbs. This is including long commutes to get often to where they're working or studying. And even still, when they're taking on those long commutes, only 15% of homes cost less than $500,000 and make access to more than 2 bedrooms. When a generation ago, that would have bought you 2 entire houses. And then if you add up the costs of commuting that extra distance over a 25-year period, typical length of a mortgage, they'll often add up to another couple $100,000, which ironically would have bought you a 3rd entire home a generation ago. And the reason it's worth having this conversation is not to say that, a younger demographic is entitled to everything. No, a younger demographic does need to suck it up. I like to use the metaphor of the salmon swimming upstream. I don't think you can find a species that has to work harder, really, to find appropriate places to raise their offspring. They don't take the easy route. They don't go with the flow. They turn around and they swim upriver. They have to go over waterfalls, beat past bears to make it to the spawning grounds. And so it should be for a younger demographic. We should have to sacrifice, we should have to have discipline, etc. But here's the challenge. This is why policy needs to adapt. The river in which we're swimming now is much more polluted in the past because the jobs pay thousands less than they used to. The waterfalls are 2 and 3 times larger because housing prices are so much more. And there are so many more bears fattening up their savings on the hard work of the young salmon swimming upstream today, that's making it much more challenging for people to get to those spawning grounds. And then, in places like the GTA or Metro Vancouver, you have literally the way almost entirely dammed off now. It just is so out of reach, those home prices relative to earnings. But when we build hydro dams in this country, we also recognize when we block the way for salmon swimming upriver, we'll build a salmon ladder that allows them step by step to make their way around this obstacle, which is otherwise good for our community. And so now is the time to think, what's the analog to that salmon ladder for younger generations of Canadians who still need to swim upstream in a housing market that is benefiting many, but is actually very harmful to them?
So we need a salmon ladder.
We need a salmon ladder.
I gotcha. I thought that metaphor was going to be tortured, but that actually worked really well.
Did that work for you?
That really worked well, I got to say.
Excellent, thank you.
Paul, I want to thank you for visiting us here at TVO tonight.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
That's Paul Kershaw from the University of British Columbia, the founder of Generation Squeeze.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.